Hello, everyone, and welcome to the eRenew webinar series on Europe and the world. I'm Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Sungjoon Cho, who will discuss his new book, co-authored with Jürgen Kurtz, Investing the ASEAN Way, Theories and Practices of Economic Integration in Southeast Asia, which was published by Cambridge University Press and which was also awarded the Best Book by the International Studies Association Law Section in 2024. Professor Dr. Sungjoon Cho is a professor of the Chicago-Kent College of Law. His scholarly research and teaching interests include international law, international economic law, international relations, and comparative law. Prior to joining academia, Sungjoon represented the government of the Republic of Korea in negotiations under the World Trade Organization and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He is also a member of the arbitration panel roster under Chapter 14, the Dispute Settlement Chapter, of the Korea-European Union Free Trade Agreement, and he has also advised the Korean government under various capacities. Also joining us today is Professor Dr. Sufyan Jusso. Sufyan is the Director and Professor of International Trade and Investment at the Institute of Malaysian International Studies at the National University of Malaysia, as well as the Chair for ASEAN Integration Grand Challenge at the university. Sufyan is also co-founder of the ASEAN Economic Integration Forum. He is an external fellow of the World Trade Institute and at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia, and a member of the Malaysian chapter of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. Sufyan is involved in the reformation of investment laws in Myanmar, Timor-Leste, Laos, and the Federated States of Micronesia. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Sungjoon of approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Sufyan to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions. We don't have Sufyan with us at the moment, so we're still waiting for him to join. But barring any technical difficulties, he should be able to join. But if he doesn't come, then we will have a slightly longer presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So either way, we'll have a nice Q&A with the audience, and you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to join in the discussion by asking your question via text, when I will read that out loud to Sungjoon. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the eRenew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or eRenew as we call it, is an Erasmus-Chamonix network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of eRenew, I would like to thank Sungjoon very much for joining us today, and hopefully Sufyan very soon. And it is my great pleasure to hand the floor over to Sungjoon. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kari, for your kind introduction. And also, many Axel and Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies for organizing this webinar. In addition, my advance thanks to Professor Jusso, who graciously agreed to a comment on our book. Finally, I would like to thank the virtual audience who came to this event. I know you might have other important things to do, and I greatly appreciate your attention to our work. But for the sake of time, I'll try to minimize my own account of our book to have enough time for Professor Jusso's comment as well as the Q&A session afterwards. First, why did we decide to write this book? What is so special about this particular work? In the summer of 2015, Jürgen, my co-author, and I embarked on a project that would probe regional law and governance in ASEAN through the lens of its regulation of foreign investment. Well, this might be a self-serving account, but we believe our book will bring the following benefit to the readership. As we all know, there are a good deal of books and journal articles about foreign investment law in general and foreign investment law in the ASEAN region in particular. Of course, those pre-existing works were useful to our own work. Nevertheless, we found two main deficiencies, if not flaws, in those works. First, on the strong assumption that more law is good. Yes, this is all about the famous Washington consensus, or a neoliberal mantra, or even the Weberian legal rationality. Relatedly, many of the conventional works in this field focus mostly on doctrinal aspects of foreign investment law, such as treaty interpretation, case law, etc. This doctrinal approach tends to create a hidden assumption that external developments are both suitable and beneficial for incorporation into ASEAN investment regime. Yet, we found that ASEAN investment regime has been very selective in adopting those external text and derivative doctrines, both substantive and procedural. So Jürgen thought that law may many different things in ASEAN is Western manifestation, which we coined global investment law. To know nuanced context, we had to explore the historical factors that led to the construction of the ASEAN investment regime, deeper contextual understanding of aspect of ASEAN beyond its legal text. So this book investigates the manner in which ASEAN's unique history and culture, which may be symbolized by the term ASEAN way, have fundamentally shaped its foreign investment policies, leading to outcomes that often depart from the external structure and script of global investment law. We realized that doing so would force us to think outside of the box of a self-referential system called law. So we decided to summon non-legal theories, especially sociological constructivist theories, as in international relations term, and apply them to conventional legal texts and doctrines to better understand and evaluate the evolution of ASEAN investment regime. This book adopts a new framework to identify the unique ontological autonomy of the ASEAN investment regime beyond the simple aggregation of its individual member states. It emphasizes ideational factors such as culture and norms that guide state actions from within. We believe this comparativist and interdisciplinary endeavor eventually paid off because we were able to offer certain policy suggestions. Our conclusion is as follows. First, law works differently in different contexts, and the Western-centered global investment law might not be a panacea for ASEAN. Second, human agency in the form of transgovernmental cooperation and the business-government partnership is critical to consolidate the ASEAN investment regime in the future. Then let me highlight some of the main themes of our book. First of all, this book concerns the regulation of foreign direct investment, the FDI, within ASEAN, which we coined the ASEAN investment regime. We argue that the ASEAN investment regime demonstrates a strong path dependency from the ASEAN way. The ASEAN way is comprised of two main principles originating from the old Javanese tradition, Musyawarah, that means deliberation, and Mufakat, that means consensus. According to Peter Boyce, the ASEAN way can be defined as follows. First, a disposition to favor summit meetings. Second, recourse to Musyawarah, the deliberation principle, and concept in the conduct of high-level conferences. Third, a preference for a concealed and often unofficial preliminary transaction by special agent prior to formal ministerial conferences. Fourth, a preference for ad hoc rather than institutionalized practice. Fifth, an avoidance of judicial or arbitration machinery for the settlement of disputes. Finally, readiness to accept mediation or good offices from friendly third parties in the region. Next, let me turn to an internal synoptic account of the ASEAN Investment Regime, which focuses on institutional evolution. By the mid-1980s, the ASEAN members began to seriously consider establishing a dedicated ASEAN treaty on foreign investment within the region. One of the most symbolic changes found in the 1987 ASEAN Agreement for Protection of Investment
We will be back in just a moment. We're just waiting for, there appears to be some technical difficulty with Professor Cho. So we are, oh, I think he's rejoining us.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's just cut off.
All right. You want to
Can I
reshare
see?
your PowerPoint then?
Yeah,
Great.
I apologize. Okay, so
Perfect. Looks good.
can I read them? Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
again,
you can put it
apologies.
maybe in, yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, I apologize. So the anti-climatic contours of the 1987 ASEAN Agreement met a moment of forced innovation due to two subsequent incidences. The first one is and the rise of China through the 1990s. Firstly, the economic impact of the Asian financial crisis, especially among Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, was, as you know, devastating. However, ironically, the collective nature of the crisis they suffered together, right, provided ASEAN members with a fresh moment of bonding. Likewise, their responses to demands from those who bailed them out, including the Bretton Woods institution, was largely common, of course, sometimes controversial. It's a common strategy from the neoliberalism. It's very drastic reform, including a more investor-friendly environment. So this kind of external crisis drove ASEAN members to pursue some internal integration among themselves. Against this background, the second informal ASEAN summit held in Kuala Lumpur in December 1997 decided to expedite the implementation of the formation of the ASEAN Investment Area, as known as AIA. So the AIA attempted to appeal to multinational enterprises whose increasingly prominent global value chains would find in the ASEAN region as an attractive investment destination. So the 1998 Framework Agreement emphasizes this open nature of AIA project. ASEAN member would now commit to a, I quote, more liberal and transparent investment environment, unquote, that would, quote, substantially increase the flow of investment from both ASEAN and non-ASEAN sources, unquote. So the AIA vision under the 1998 Framework Agreement culminated to the 2009, the most recent Comprehensive Investment Agreement, ACIA. What distinguished the ACIA from the earlier 1987 and 1998 ASEAN instruments is the former's strong community building teleology. For example, the preamble of the ACIA highlight, a quote and unquote, more integrated and interdependent future, which could be achieved by, quote unquote, joint promotion of the region as an integrated investment area. I emphasize the word integration. In particular, the ACIA endeavors to address legal uncertainties under the earlier investment instrument and try to conform to quote unquote comparable to international best practices. So ACIA's entry into force terminates the earlier instrument like 1987 agreement and 1998 agreement. Most of all, formally burdensome approval preconditions, such as the approval in writing requirement, are now subject to a due process style procedural discipline. Given this rich and dynamic evolutionary trajectory of the ASEAN investment regime, relying entirely on an insight offered by a single theory risks generating only a static snapshot of the regime, neglecting its panoramic nature. In describing a macro structure like culture, in each stage of ASEAN investment regime's organizational development, we adopt some kind of metaphoric representation, such as Hobbesian, Lockean, and Kantian, developed by the Alexander Webster. This metaphor signifies a dominant role, such as adversary or competitor and fellow, that each developmental stage may assign in the self-others configurations. These are not necessarily empirical manifestations at each stage, but highly abstract ideal types of structural logic that hold unique explanatory power in social rather than material terms. In general, these three cultures parallel neoliberalism in case of Hobbesian and neoliberal institutionalism in case of Lockean and constructivism in case of Kantian, respectively. Roughly speaking, these three cultures tend to demonstrate a sequential development. Hobbesian before the 1980 agreement, to Lockean from the 1980 to 1998 agreement, and eventually to Kantian, the 1998 and 2000 agreement. So in the first place, the ASEAN investment regime now, like represented by the most recent iteration, which is ACIA in 2009, that seems quite seems to have evolved into global investment law. So first of all, what do we mean by global investment law? For the purpose of this book, global investment law refers to a manifestation of hard legalization in the area of investment liberalization and protection of foreign investment. It naturally connotes representative legal practices on international investment regulation demonstrated by bilateral treaties, BITs, and some investment chapters in regional trade agreement, such as the old NAFTA Chapter 11, spearheaded by the advanced countries, developed countries like United States and Europe. Politically, it is an embodiment of neoliberal idea or the Washington Consensus. Historically, it is based on a Weberian version, the Max Weber version of rule of law that functions as a guarantor for free market economy. It is a form of hard legalization in the sense that it presupposes a kinetic version of rule of law that accompanies litigation and enforcement. Importantly, however, a later stage may still retain a certain philosophical footprints of an earlier stage, depending on the degrees of norm internalization. In other words, past dependency has led even the most advanced ACIA in 2009 to still retain an encapsulated identity constituted by the ASEAN way in earlier stage, despite transparency and due process in the approval process. So under ACI, ASEAN states carved out a colossal space for sovereign decisions on the terms by which they may approve investment from their fellow ASEAN members. While the 1998 Framework Agreement is now terminated upon the ACIA's entry in force, still the old agreements, temporary exclusion and sensitive list still remain valid under the new ACI, and the ACI also come up with its own list of long reservations. Critically, this enduring relics of the ASEAN way diverges from global investment law, and therefore characterize the ASEAN investment regime. In our book, we theorize this divergence as delegalization. Obviously, global investment law reflects the conventional logic of Western capital exporting nations. The conventional neoliberal way of thinking behind this is that if global investment law is implemented in earnest in non-Western capital importing nations like ASEAN nations, lead to a more foreign investment. However, empirical evidence has been mixed in this regard. Note that many developing countries sign BITs to receive a badge of honor or reputational effect rather than an immediate impact to inbound foreign investment. In this line, it was more ritual than functional. Therefore, as our book carefully explains, the ASEAN nations' implementation of global investment law among themselves has been pretty selective, which cannot be fully understood purely through a typical functionalist output. If we subscribe to the functional dimension of rule of law, according to Max Weber, ASEAN nations must have conformed to global investment law to the fullest extent if they want to increase foreign direct investment among themselves. However, ASEAN nations have a different concept of legal rationality as evidenced by their selective implementation of global investment law. They conclude that under their historical and cultural context, known as the ASEAN way, negating such a narrow functional version of legal rationality, such as confrontational adversarial legalism, that works for them better. So they have actually documented in their treaties, like ACIA, the departure from the typical global investment law, and instead intentionally secured a regulatory space by inserting ambiguities and loopholes. We label this phenomenon as delegalization. It is important to understand delegalization as a new form of legalization. And delegalization is neither deviation from law nor failure of legalization. Delegalization protects the ASEAN version of rule of law from the Western aggressive version of rule of law. Its nuanced legal function must be understood in tandem with a long-held tradition of meritocracy, like human agency, or rule of man within the Asian context. Is the rule of man human agency should not be treated as a pejorative version of substantial rationality or code justice advanced by Max Weber. Now, let me turn to a normative critique of the ASEAN investment regime, known as the paradox of reverse open regimes. As I mentioned above, the complicated evolutionary trajectory of the ASEAN investment regime has been characterized by the selective adoption of global investment law informed by the ASEAN Way and delegalization. Inevitably, however, this structural complication has generated a dilemma or paradox, if you like, that potentially undermines the long-term goal of ASEAN economic integration. On the one hand, ASEAN has adopted quite neoliberal global investment law voluntarily in regulating extra ASEAN investment, which means FDI between ASEAN members and non-ASEAN members like United States or European countries. On the other, however, is regulation of intra-ASEAN investment regime among its own members has been more restrictive for its sovereignty-preserving tendency. So in this book, we conceptualize this problem as reverse open regimes. It refers to a situation where a better treatment is accorded exclusively to outsiders, non-ASEAN members, to the detriment to the insiders, the ASEAN members themselves, thus open to outsiders yet insiders. This is the paradox. In terms of ASEAN investment regime, this means that uneven degree of foreign investment opening between extra-ASEAN BITs and intra-ASEAN investment treaties. So, in general, foreign investors' rights are better protected in the extra-ASEAN BITs than in the intra-ASEAN investment treaties. For example, when it comes to investor protection, the extra-ASEAN BITs exhibit fewer reservations and exceptions in host state obligation than the intra-ASEAN investment treaty. Interestingly, ASEAN countries seems largely unconcerned with the sovereignty cost incurred by being members of the World Trade Organization like WTO, which is fairly legalized organization. For example, Singapore would sue Malaysia under the WTO dispute settlement system. So this peculiar asymmetry in embracing legalization between an extra-ASEAN matter and an intra-ASEAN economic matter that characterize the ASEAN way. Even though it's understandable from the cultural perspective, such a gap between intra-ASEAN and extra-ASEAN investment liberalization undermines ASEAN's economic integration represented by the ASEAN Economic Community, AEC blueprint. According to ASEAN Investment Regime 2022, intra-ASEAN FDI flows account for only 12% of the total FDIs in the ASEAN region. Overcoming the reverse open regionalism paradox is also necessary to harness the emerging engine of global value chain. ASEAN firms can diversify their exports by participating in both local and global value chain. Considering the organic relationship between services and investment in global value chains, intra-ASEAN investment liberalization can be a tremendous impetus for the creation of factory ASEAN or global ASEAN. And this is ASEAN centrality they endeavor to achieve. Then, what should ASEAN members do in order to close this perilous gap between the intra-ASEAN investment and the extra-ASEAN investment? The Washington Consensus would recommend further legalization of ASEAN investment regime. However, the central theme of our book, such as delegalization, is very skeptical about these legalized solutions. Instead, we emphasize non-legalized tools such as soft law governance and human agency, especially patterned after the APEC model, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation model. As many have already been witnessed in the APEC experience, soft law governance appears to be well received in the ASEAN region and East Asian region in general. Moreover, solid and effective government networks that already exist among working level government officials of ASEAN members can play a critical role in mobilizing concerted effort from ASEAN members toward voluntary unilateral liberalization in intra-ASEAN investment flows. For example, ASEAN leaders can empower the Coordinating Committee on Investment, CCI, under the ASEAN Investment Area, AIA Council, comprised of senior government officials, by throwing their political support behind this committee's recommendation in relevant areas. Furthermore, given the increasing importance of public-private, private-public partnership in managing the connectivity of global value chains, the CCI must collaborate with the private sector's agency, such as the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit under the auspices of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. And they can identify priority points of liberalization and formulating workable program to achieve those goals. Indeed, it has been an established tradition in ASEAN that businesses rely on various levels of discretion vested in government officials rather than turning to formal rules in addressing a particular non-tariff barriers. Now, let me conclude my presentation. There are some takeaways from our book. First, we have to recognize unique context of the ASEAN investment regime. Legal framework function differently across a context. Western-centric global investment law is not always optimal for ASEAN, although still it is beneficial. Second, we have to leverage human agency as a solution instead of continuous legalization. Human agency manifested through transgovernmental cooperation and business government partnership is very pivotal to the evolution of the ASEAN investment regime. Finally, the ASEAN selective engagement with global investment law necessitates a closer examination of its long-term developmental trajectory and its capacity to balance economic openness with regulatory autonomy. I'm afraid I have talked too much already. Let me stop here and turn to Professor Juso for his intervention. And thank you for your attention. And my apologies in the middle. The connections was cut for a short time. Yeah, that was a technical glitch.
No problem. It happens all the time.
Thank you for
Um,
understanding.
thank you so much for this wonderful presentation of your book. It's really, really fascinating, and I hope to pick it up soon myself. And I encourage the audience also to check that out. I just want to see has Professor Sufyan Jusso entered the room? I don't see him in the participant list yet. He's apparently been having some technical difficulties. But if he hasn't joined yet, then I have a bunch of questions myself that I can kick off the discussion with, and I would like to encourage the audience to enter your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You see the little Q&A question mark down there. You can type your questions in there, and we will get to those shortly. But first, if I may, I'll start with a couple of my own questions, and then maybe we'll turn back to you to respond to those first, and then we can open up to questions from the audience. All right. So the book explores the concept of delegalization in the ASEAN investment regime, and it suggests a shift away from formal legal commitments towards more flexible, informal governance mechanisms, if I got that right. So to what extent does delegalization enhance or hinder investor confidence or economic integration within ASEAN? Can ASEAN balance legal certainty with the need for adaptability in this rapidly evolving global economy? So that's the first one. The second one is the ASEAN approach to investment governance often departs from narrow functionalist interpretations of law, which you described, by emphasizing informal consensus, quora, and political negotiation and economic pragmatism, as you described. So how does this alternative rationality, as you called it, shape regional cooperation and power dynamics between the member states of ASEAN? And does it create a more inclusive and adaptable framework, or does it risk reinforcing existing asymmetries between some of the stronger and weaker economies within ASEAN? And then a third question that we can start off with would be to bring EU into the discussion a little bit, since this is the EU Renew project. Since we're EU Renew, so given the influence of external economic powers in the region, including the European Union, of course, and in shaping global investment norms, how does ASEAN navigate external legal and regulatory pressures while maintaining its distinctive approach? To what extent does engagement with the EU and its investment policies challenge or reinforce ASEAN's investment governance model? And as the EU attempts to assert its values through trade or this open strategic autonomy you might have heard about, its current strategy for foreign affairs, through trade and investment agreements, namely through the inclusion of sustainable development chapters, how does ASEAN navigate these external pressures? So those are the first three questions, and we'll turn over to you for those, and then we'll see if the audience has any questions. Feel free to add those questions to the Q&A. Back over to you.
Thank you so much, Kari. These three questions, all excellent questions, and I really truly wish I could receive this question before I complete my book. And my book would have been a lot better than the current version if I had incorporated all these excellently issues. First of all, yeah, delegalization. I know, so there's a possible critique. Actually, some people criticize earlier, that this delegalization, it might work for ASEAN, but somehow could kind of undermine the foreign investor confidence, especially those investors from the Western countries, right? Because they're so accustomed to this kind of legal environment, and they need some kind of assurances, which is true, but there's some kind of, every investor destination is different, and they know, right? So from the standpoint of foreign investor, I'm a kind of a Belgium investor. I want to invest in ASEAN, right? And every investment, they assuming some risks, right? So you have a business risks, you have risks from the weather or storm, and you risks from some legal uncertainties, right? Right? So it's a part of those risks, and every risk is different in country. But in ASEAN, despite of these risks actually, and we have to understand that these days, for many regions, ASEAN is really hotspot for investor destination. The numbers, number one, for many regions. First of all, even before trade war, ASEAN's investment skyrocketed, right? It was deep down a little bit because of COVID, but it's very impressively quickly recovered from the COVID. And a lot of money is coming, toward, the ASEAN region because of its potential. For 2030, 2035, a lot of almost like half of the global middle income class will reside in ASEAN area and the broader East Asian area, right? So this is huge potential. So with or without those legal risks, Western money will flood into the ASEAN region. So they have a leverage. It's important to understand the leverage, and then they have ASEAN members, of course. They can have this, kind of leverage to shift from this global investment law to their own, frames of the legalization and trade war. As you know well, because of trade war, right? A lot of capital from China and also some other countries. Now the ASEAN, like Vietnam and Thailand, the rerouting, this global value chain from China. That also helps to give more legal leverage to ASEAN delegalization. And true, some issues about this, lack of this formal legal assurance. That's definitely minus, but could be complemented by the other factors that makes ASEAN as an attractive investor destination. Second, a rule of law. That's also very important issue that my book does not cover pretty much because it's more power politics, right? It's beyond economic issues, but you're very right. In ASEAN in general, there's a power dynamics in the middle of this ASEAN's own way of rule of law, kind of practical and formative. So flexibility unofficial means you're vulnerable to power dynamics, right? Power dynamics. And it is true. The biggest, player, right? The large player is Indonesia. And definitely Indonesia desire this flexible governance like this. Actually, the deliberation, consensus, the rule is from Indonesia, Musyawarah and Mufakat, right? Because obviously they are better positioned to use this kind of tools, right? Power-based because they're a powerful country. In contrast, another member, small but still economically very strong, Singapore, right? Singapore, they desire for more the Western style rule of law. So there's some tension, and we cannot ignore that tension as well. So, and I would say it is some combination between these two. And I'm not saying even delegalization is just, destroying all this, global investment law. Still, it's a kind of they navigating, but they navigating on their own terms. So we'll see how they incorporate this, global investment law to check against this possible, use of power. And they now witnessing the United States, the Trump administration's, blatant use of this naked power, real politics, and I think that would be, give them some kind of a wake-up call, right? So always is, shuttle, between these two hard and soft legalization. Finally, European Union, of course. European Union's presence in Southeast Asia is huge, as you know, right? It's for many reasons, for historical reasons and also for kind of business reasons and for strategic reasons. And actually, some serious people, they argued, ASEAN, for the sake of their further prosperity, you have to be more integrated among yourself. So advanced integration is a kind of precondition for ASEAN's future prosperity. So you have to emulate what? European Union, right? So you have to become like European Union, supranational organization, very tight rule of law. Some people argue that, but obviously my book is against that kind of proposal because it's too different, very different, right? But that leaves another question, how European Union must engage with ASEAN, which has very different legal sensitivity, right? And legal framework, right? I think that's a challenge. That's future challenge. But I know, even the European Union is Western tradition, legal tradition. They seek hard legalization, the dispute settlement system and everything, a court system. But still, they have a very well, historically, they have a very well developed bureaucratic structure. So when it comes to bureaucratic structure, full, comprised of clear, officials, right? It's a bit different from the United States. The United States, the government system, very politicized, and also, the way it works, I would say Europe's bureaucratic structure is pretty, there's a kinship with the East Asian type of, bureaucratic system. So I bet even though this formal legal structure might be different, and there's some kind of tension, of course, several years ago when European Court of Justice rejected the ISDS of all the, the BITs and regional trade agreement, and they stick to a kind of investment court, right? So there's kind of some tension because of the formal legal structure of their own system. But still, there's a huge potential between European Union, European Commission in particular, and ASEAN, secretary, each government, bureaucratic, the government officials, right? There's a huge potential for bureaucratic engagement between and among working level officials, not necessarily high rankers, but working level officials, right? That's important, right? The transgovernmental, network, that they do most of work with that level. And then they will, if there's certain consensus and workable programs, and they can submit that to a summit. So I think that kind of soft governance works pretty well with the European Union instead of this engaging with the hard legalization. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. And so we just have a couple of other questions before we wrap up today. So our first one is asking that is mentioning that there has already been some pushback within global investment law, with some countries eager to claim more regulatory space in recent years, not just in ASEAN region, but elsewhere. Do you see some of these trends of ASEAN's evolution towards delegalization and the path you've described reflected in some of the other regions throughout the world? I know this is kind of going outside the range of the book, but maybe you've noticed some of this in your studies. And then another one asks about with global economic shifts and tech advancements and some of the geopolitical tensions. You've already mentioned Trump, but maybe also some of the various wars happening in different parts of the world. Are these trends shaping the future of investment in ASEAN in any way? Has there been anything that you think might affect the future of investment in ASEAN? And then finally, how does diversity among the different member states impact investment policies and economic integration within the region? And is consensus on certain issues more difficult to realize than on other issues? For instance, in some areas of the world, consensus on human rights or environmental issues can be quite contentious. Do you see any particular issues within the region more difficult to achieve consensus on than others? And I think we'll stop there. I think that's probably all the time we'll have for now. Back over to you.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, this is a great, also the three questions is, it's a great questions. The first one, yeah, already happening, pushback. This is true. It's not only ASEAN, it's beyond ASEAN. Actually, I mention this because it's the time constraint. In my book, we did address that issue. We labeled this negative social learning, right? Negative social learning. So ASEAN region, they also learn from the external experiences, especially when even rich countries, they push back against this, original model of, investor protection. Even United States, they have a new model law, model BIT, and they're trying to expand the space for sovereign kind of sovereign space, regulatory autonomy, right? So a lot of criticism, even among rich countries, United States and Europe. This is the BIT, the Global Investment Law, right? It's comprised of pre-existing BITs. It's too investor-oriented, too pro-investor. They undermining the regulatory autonomy of host countries. Again, not only this, capital importing country, but even, capital exporting country. Capital exporting country at the same time, they can be capital, importing countries, right? So the alarm, actually sounded not only in, a developing country like Indonesia, the Indonesia, Ecuador, and they terminated, some, the part of, BITs like state investor in dispute resolution, but also, the rich country, they're trying to, change this region. So that part, ASEANs, they learned from this and they reflected also on, they knew the problems and it's kind of a learning, and which is true. So I agree with that observation. It happens even before the ASEAN's delegalization strategies. Second, war and geopolitics, what is the future of ASEAN? Actually, many observers, believe this new geopolitical tension could be beneficial to ASEAN's, further, development, especially trade and investment, right? And because, again, the challenge for ASEAN is how can you synthesize, right? Synthesize external ASEAN economic governance and intra-ASEAN economic governance, right? So you may want to make this a virtual circle of external, internal, flow of trade and investment, right? And I think these external, tensions, geopolitics will give a strength and incentive for that endeavor, because again, a lot of money, capital will flood into ASEAN region for many reasons, right? Because this is a kind of, in a sense, some middle powers, right? Very promising economic trajectory, and also even politically, they are pretty neutral, right? As you see, as you saw this, their responses, ASEAN member responses to Ukraine-Russian, war, right? Trying to be very neutral. So they are kind of, in economic terms, they are connector economy. They connect between global South and global North, right? They have, factories and, some data centers in Malaysia, and right? They're part of the global value chain. So they're bridging China and United States and Europe. So it's very promising area. So I think that could be beneficial actually. So again, crisis at the same time is opportunity, and especially so in ASEAN. Finally, diversity, you're right, ASEAN, this fifth, the ASEAN members is very diverse. First of all, economic development, very diverse, very advanced country like Singapore, but at the same time, the three countries, the least developed countries member, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, right? So economic gap, that's a big question, a big problem, and that's actually leading to some kind of poor quality of policies, collective policies, because economic stage is so different. It's hard to come up with some workable solution about the common policies, especially the investment liberalization kind of things. And so that's a challenge, and there's ASEAN have to come up with some kind of not the short-term solution, but the mid-term and long-term solution. And again, that's why human agency is important in this kind of situation to radically close the gap with kind of formal legalization. I think that doesn't make any sense, right? So it's more like, workman-like, incremental and patient, under the radar cooperation is very necessary to get this, to close this gap. And finally, of course, politically, relatively pretty stable in ASEAN, and that's a huge, contribution from the very institution ASEAN, right? Started from 1996, 1966 and 1967, around that area, the ASEAN created. And the reason for creation of ASEAN was some kind of a quasi-military confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia. We called confrontasi at the time. So it started from the security, agreement, right? So it's, kudos to ASEAN for right now. Of course, there's, some issues in Myanmar and, some other areas, but still relatively stable. And it's a human rights issue and a governance issue. And that's kind of internal challenge the ASEAN have to, kind of address, because as you know, if there's some regional political chaos, foreign direct investment will chill, right? So that's their future. But I think the ASEAN's, again, the ASEAN way, I think is pretty suitable for tackling that kind of issue. They've been doing good job for thus far, right? And I believe they will keep doing in that way. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for these very thoughtful responses, and to all of the audience for joining in this question and answer session. That is all the time we have for today. I want to thank you so much, Professor Sungjoon Cho, for joining us today and for taking part in this webinar. It's sad that we were unable to get Professor Sufyan Jusso to join, but hopefully we'll be able to interact with him again, and maybe we'll be able to at least get him to send his discussion questions over to you, Professor Cho. But before leaving you, I would just like to quickly remind the audience that our winter and spring lineup has already been announced on our website all the way through June. So you can go ahead and check that out, where we'll be bringing in Hilke Dijkstra, Petro Mavridis, Wolfgang Weiss, Cornelia Furculita, and Jennifer Clapp in the coming months. So please come join us for additional webinars. And you can see that schedule, and you can sign up for all of those at eu-renew.eu. But thank you again so much, Professor, for joining us today, and to the audience for taking part in this webinar.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to
Bye-bye.
have you. Bye-bye.
Stay warm.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.